The crimson sun hung low over the desolate mountains of Velthara when Marcus Thorne first heard the screams. He had been tracking the alien scout ships for 3 days, following their strange energy signatures across the wasteland that had once been his homeland. The screams were different from human voices, carrying an otherworldly melody that made his soul ache with unexpected longing. Marcus crouched behind a boulder, his weathered hands gripping the plasma rifle he had salvaged from a fallen alien warrior months ago. His dark eyes scanned the valley below, where 2 massive crystalline structures pulsed with an eerie blue light. The aliens had been building these towers across the planet for 6 months now, each one draining the life force from everything within a 50-mile radius. But this tower was different. The screams continued, and Marcus realized they weren't cries of pain or fear. They were songs of defiance, beautiful and haunting despite the desperation they carried. Through his scope, he could make out 2 figures chained to the base of the crystal structure. Even from this distance, he could see they weren't human. The creatures were tall and graceful, with scales that shimmered between silver and deep purple in the dying light. Their wings, though bound by energy shackles, still held traces of magnificent membrane that caught the tower's glow like stained glass. Dragonmaidens, he realized with a shock. He had heard whispers of such beings from the few survivors who still wandered the wasteland, but he had dismissed them as myths born from desperation and madness. Marcus had been fighting alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to care about someone else's fate. His wife and daughter had been among the first casualties when the Void Hunters arrived from the depths of space, their massive ships blotting out the sun as they descended upon Earth. He had watched his home burn, had held his family's lifeless bodies in his arms before taking up arms against the invaders. The aliens called themselves the Krethmori, and they harvested life force to fuel their dying homeworld. But Marcus simply called them monsters. He had made it his mission to destroy every tower, every ship, every last trace of their presence on his world. He had become a ghost, a legend whispered about in the underground camps where humans still gathered in secret. As he watched the Dragonmaidens struggle against their bonds, Marcus felt something stir within his chest that he had thought died with his family. The taller of the 2 creatures lifted her head, and even across the distance, her golden eyes seemed to lock with his own. There was intelligence there, and a desperate hope that made his breath catch in his throat. The Krethmori guards moved around the tower in a patrol pattern that Marcus had memorized over the past hour. There were 12 of them, each standing nearly 8 feet tall with armor that seemed to be grown rather than forged. Their faces were hidden behind masks that resembled insect mandibles, and their movements were fluid and predatory. Marcus checked his equipment one more time. In addition to the plasma rifle, he carried a bandolier of explosive charges he had crafted from salvaged materials, a vibro blade that could cut through most alien armor, and a small medical kit that had saved his life more times than he could count. It wasn't much against an entire Krethmori outpost, but he had learned to make do with less. The plan forming in his mind was suicide by any reasonable measure. The tower was protected by energy barriers that would fry anything that tried to approach without the proper authorization codes. The guards were armed with weapons that could dissolve a human body in seconds, and their reflexes were far superior to anything Marcus possessed. But as he watched the Dragonmaidens singing their defiant songs, Marcus realized that some things were worth dying for. He had been surviving for so long that he had forgotten how to truly live. Maybe it was time to remember what he had been fighting for all along. The first guard never saw him coming. Marcus moved like a shadow, using every technique he had learned during his months of guerrilla warfare against the invaders. The vibroblade sliced through the alien's neck with barely a whisper, and Marcus caught the body before it could hit the ground and alert the others. He dragged the corpse behind a supply crate and quickly stripped it of its armor and weapon. The Krethmori gear was designed for their physiology, but Marcus had learned to adapt alien technology through necessity and desperation. The armor plates wouldn't fit properly, but he could wear enough of them to fool the automated sensors from a distance. The disguise wouldn't hold up under close scrutiny, but it would get him past the energy barriers. Marcus activated the stolen access codes and felt a chill run through his body as the tower's defenses recognized him as a friendly unit. The barriers parted like a curtain, and he stepped into the heart of the alien stronghold. The Dragonmaidens had stopped singing, and their golden eyes tracked his movement as he approached. Up close, he could see that their beauty was both alien and strangely familiar, as if they represented something humanity had once known but had forgotten in the rush toward technology and conquest. Their scales held depth and warmth that reminded him of his daughter's laughter, and their bound wings spoke of freedom lost but not forgotten. The taller of the two opened her mouth and spoke in a voice like silver bells mixed with distant thunder. The words were in a language Marcus didn't recognize, but somehow he understood their meaning. She was warning him that this was a trap, that the Krethmori had been using them as bait to lure something powerful to this place. Marcus paused in his approach, his hand tightening on the plasma rifle. The alien weapon hummed with barely contained energy, and he could feel its power thrumming through his bones. Around him, the tower continued its work, drawing life from the surrounding landscape and channeling it into the crystal core that pulsed above their heads like a mechanical heart. The Dragon Maiden spoke again, her voice urgent and melodic despite her predicament. She was telling him to leave, to save himself while he still could. But Marcus had come too far to turn back now. He had spent too many months running and hiding, striking from the shadows and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Tonight, he would make a stand. As if summoned by his resolve, the remaining Krethmori guards emerged from their hiding places around the tower's base. They moved with predatory grace, their weapons already powered up and ready to fire. Marcus counted 11 of them, which meant his disguise had been penetrated from the moment he stepped through the barriers. The lead guard removed its mask, revealing a face that was a nightmare fusion of insect and reptile features. Its voice was a sound like breaking glass when it spoke in perfectly accented English. The Krethmori had studied humanity extensively during their invasion, and they took pride in speaking their victims' languages fluently. The creature explained that they had been expecting him for days. The warrior who moved like a ghost, who had destroyed 7 of their harvest towers and killed more than 50 of their soldiers. They had spent considerable resources tracking his movements and analyzing his tactics. The Dragon Maidens had been bait, but not for the reasons Marcus had imagined. As the alien spoke, Marcus began to understand the true scope of the trap he had walked into. The Krethmori weren't just harvesting life force from Earth. They were preparing for something much worse, something that required specific types of energy that could only be found in certain rare beings. The Dragon Maidens possessed one type of this energy, but they needed something else to complete their ritual. They needed the life force of a human who had been touched by despair but had refused to surrender hope. They needed someone who had lost everything but continued fighting not for victory, but simply because fighting was all they knew how to do. They needed Marcus Thorne, the last warrior of a dying world. The trap was perfect in its simplicity. By trying to save the Dragon Maidens, Marcus had delivered himself directly into their hands. The tower wasn't just a harvesting station. It was a prison designed specifically to hold beings of extraordinary spiritual power. Once they activated the containment field, escape would become impossible. But Marcus had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for expensive. As the Krethmori guards closed in around him, he smiled for the first time in months. The alien leader mistook his expression for madness or despair, but the Dragon Maidens recognized it for what it truly was. Marcus Thorne had finally found something worth dying for, which meant he had also found something worth living for. The real battle was about to begin, and he intended to show these creatures from beyond the stars exactly why humanity had earned its reputation as the most stubborn species in the galaxy. The tower's crystal core pulsed faster, as if sensing the approaching conflict, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of more alien ships approaching echoed across the desolate landscape. Marcus checked his weapons one last time and prepared to discover whether one man's desperate courage could stand against the darkness that had swallowed his world. The first blast from the Krethmori energy weapon missed Marcus by inches, leaving a smoking crater in the ground where he had been standing. He rolled behind one of the tower's support pillars, feeling the heat wash over him as more shots followed in rapid succession. The stolen alien armor plates on his shoulders sparked and cracked under the assault, but they had absorbed enough energy to keep him alive. Marcus returned fire with the plasma rifle, the bright blue bolt striking one of the advancing guard's center mass. The alien's armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force of the blast sent it staggering backward. These weren't the same type of Krethmori soldiers he had fought before. Their armor was thicker, their movements more coordinated, and their weapons packed enough punch to vaporize a tank. The Dragon Maidens were shouting something in their musical language, their voices rising above the sound of weapons fire. Marcus couldn't understand their words, but their tone was urgent and instructional. The taller of the two was straining against her energy shackles, trying to point toward something with her bound wing. Following her gesture, Marcus spotted a control panel built into the base of the tower about 30 feet away. The alien symbols on its surface were pulsing in rhythm with the crystal core above, and thick cables connected it to the energy barriers that held the Dragonmaidens captive. If he could reach that panel, he might be able to free them and gain two powerful allies in his fight against the Crethmori. But 30 feet might as well have been 30 miles with 11 enemy soldiers between him and his target. Marcus pressed his back against the pillar and tried to think. The explosives in his bandolier were powerful enough to damage the tower's structure, but using them while the Dragonmaidens were still chained to the base would likely kill them along with their captors. A new sound cut through the weapon's fire, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the very air around them. Marcus looked up to see three massive Crethmori battle cruisers descending from the night sky, their hulls bristling with weapon turrets and sensor arrays. Each ship was easily the size of a city block, and their combined firepower could reduce the entire mountain range to ash. The alien commander called out an order in the Crethmori language, and his soldiers immediately stopped firing. The sudden silence was more ominous than the battle had been, and Marcus felt his blood chill as he realized what was happening. They were no longer trying to kill him. They were herding him toward the control panel, exactly where he wanted to go. It was another layer of the trap, as elegant and deadly as everything else the aliens had planned. They wanted him to free the Dragonmaidens, because whatever ritual they were planning required all three prisoners to be unshackled when the ships reached position overhead. Marcus was not just walking into a trap, he was being manipulated into springing it himself. But as he looked at the two captive beings, still singing their defiant songs despite their hopeless situation, Marcus realized he didn't care about the trap anymore. Some choices transcended strategy and survival. Some choices were about who you decided to be when everything else was stripped away. Marcus broke cover and ran toward the control panel, weaving between the support pillars as energy blasts lit up the air around him. The Crethmori soldiers were firing to miss, but they were making it look convincing. Their shots came close enough to singe his hair and melt the edges of his stolen armor. He reached the control panel and dropped to one knee, examining the alien symbols with desperate intensity. The Crethmori language was unlike anything human linguists had encountered, based on mathematical concepts that human minds could barely grasp. But Marcus had been studying captured alien technology for months, and he had developed an intuitive understanding of their basic operational systems. The panel responded to his touch, alien text scrolling across its surface as he worked through the command sequences. Behind him, he could hear the Dragonmaiden songs growing more urgent, and he realized they were trying to guide him through the process. Their voices rose and fell in patterns that matched the symbol combinations he needed to input. The energy shackles around the first Dragonmaiden's wings flickered and died. She spread her magnificent appendages for the first time in what must have been weeks, and Marcus saw that they were even more beautiful than he had imagined. The membrane between the wing struts was translucent and seemed to contain swirling galaxies of silver and purple light. As soon as she was free, the Dragonmaiden launched herself into the air with a grace that defied the laws of physics. She moved like liquid starlight, diving toward the nearest Crethmori soldier with claws extended. Her attack was so swift and unexpected that the alien barely had time to raise its weapon before she tore through its armor like paper. The second set of shackles took longer to deactivate, and Marcus could feel the battle cruisers growing closer overhead. Their engines created a pressure in the air that made his teeth ache, and the temperature around the tower began to rise as they powered up their primary weapons. Whatever the aliens had planned, it was about to begin. The second Dragonmaiden broke free just as the lead battle cruiser settled into position directly above the crystal tower. She was smaller than her companion, but moved with even greater speed, becoming a blur of silver scales and deadly grace as she engaged two soldiers simultaneously. Her fighting style was different from the first Maiden's raw power, relying on precision strikes and impossible aerial maneuvers. Marcus watched in amazement as the two creatures worked together to systematically dismantle the Crethmori ground forces. They moved like they had been fighting as a team for centuries, anticipating each other's moves and covering each other's attacks with flawless coordination. Within minutes, half of the alien soldiers were down, their broken bodies scattered around the tower's base. But the victory was short-lived. A beam of pure energy descended from the lead battle cruiser, striking the crystal tower's core with enough force to light up the entire valley. The tower's structure began to change, its surfaces becoming more translucent as massive amounts of power flowed through its crystalline matrix. The Dragonmaidens' songs changed pitch, becoming a harmony of warning and despair. Marcus realized that the aliens had never intended to prevent their escape. The ritual required all three prisoners to be free when the tower reached full power because it wasn't designed to harvest their life force while they were restrained. It was designed to amplify it. The tower was becoming a massive psychic amplifier, designed to take the combined spiritual energy of the Dragonmaidens and Marcus himself and broadcast it across the galaxy. But broadcast it for what purpose? As the realization hit him, Marcus felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. The Krethmori weren't just invading Earth. They were preparing to invade everywhere, every inhabited world within 1,000 light-years of their position. The energy signature they were creating would serve as a beacon, calling more of their kind from the depths of space and providing them with a targeting system for their expansion across the galaxy. Earth wasn't just being harvested. It was being turned into a staging ground for the conquest of the known universe, and Marcus had just helped them complete the final component of their cosmic weapon. The Dragonmaidens weren't just prisoners. They were the key to unlocking a power that could enslave every sentient species in the galaxy. The alien commander, the only Krethmori soldier still standing, began to laugh. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying worlds, and it echoed off the tower's transformed structure with supernatural resonance. He explained in his perfect English that Marcus had performed exactly as predicted, that every choice he had made had been foreseen and planned for. The humans had been chosen as the final component not because of their resistance, but because of their hope. The Krethmori had studied dozens of species before arriving at Earth, and they had learned that despair and determination created the strongest psychic resonance when combined with the Dragonmaidens' natural energy. Marcus wasn't just a prisoner. He was the final ingredient in a recipe for universal domination. As the tower's power continued to build, Marcus felt something stirring deep within his chest. It was the same sensation he had experienced when he first heard the Dragonmaidens' songs, but now it was growing stronger, more focused. The energy wasn't just flowing through the tower. It was flowing through him as well, connecting him to the two magnificent creatures who fought beside him. The taller Dragonmaiden landed beside him, her golden eyes meeting his with an expression of shared understanding. She spoke again in her musical language, but this time Marcus comprehended every word. She was telling him that the aliens had made one critical error in their calculations. They had assumed that hope and despair were emotions that could be manipulated and controlled. They had failed to understand that hope, true hope, was not an emotion at all. It was a choice, a decision to continue fighting not because victory was possible, but because fighting was the only way to honor everything that had been lost. And choices, unlike emotions, could not be predicted or controlled. The second Dragonmaiden joined them, her silver scales now glowing with an inner light that matched the tower's crystal core. Together, the three of them formed a triangle around the control panel, and Marcus realized that the aliens had given them exactly what they needed to turn their own weapon against them. The tower wasn't just an amplifier for psychic energy. It was a transmitter, capable of sending any signal across the galaxy with enough power to reach every corner of known space. And if the signal could call the Krethmori to Earth, it could also call something else. Marcus looked up at the three battle cruisers hovering overhead and smiled again. The aliens had studied human tactics and psychology extensively, but they had made one crucial oversight. They had learned how humans fought when they had something to lose. They had never learned how humans fought when they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The real battle was just beginning, and the outcome would determine the fate of every living world in the galaxy. The energy flowing between Marcus and the Dragonmaidens intensified as they formed their triangular formation around the control panel. He could feel their thoughts touching his mind, not invasively, but like the gentle brush of wings against his consciousness. Through their mental connection, he began to understand things about the universe that human science had never discovered. The Dragonmaidens were not just refugees from a conquered world. They were guardians, members of an ancient order that had protected the galaxy from threats like the Krethmori for millions of years. Their species had evolved alongside the cosmic forces that bound star systems together, developing abilities that allowed them to manipulate energy on a scale that dwarfed anything the invaders possessed. But their power came with a cost. They could not use it for destruction without losing themselves to the very forces they sought to control. They were healers and protectors by nature, capable of incredible feats of creation and preservation, but limited in their ability to fight back against pure malevolence. They had been captured precisely because their compassionate nature prevented them from simply annihilating their enemies. That was where Marcus came in. Human beings possessed something that neither the Dragonmaidens nor the Krethmori fully understood. Humans could channel vast amounts of destructive energy without losing their essential nature, because destruction and creation were equally part of their species' identity. They could tear down mountains and build cities, wage terrible wars and create beautiful art, all without fundamentally changing who they were. Through the mental link, the taller dragon maiden shared her name. She was called Lyrale, which meant Song of the Silver Dawn in the ancient tongue of her people. Her companion was Shethys, whose name translated to Heart of the Storm's Eye. They had been hunting the Krethmori across the galaxy for decades, following the trail of dead worlds and harvested civilizations. Earth had not been their destination. They had been drawn here by the same beacon that had attracted Marcus to this tower, a psychic distress call sent by the planet itself as it died under the alien invasion. But they had arrived too late to prevent the harvesting, and their ship had been destroyed in the battle that led to their capture. Now, as the tower's crystal core pulsed with ever-increasing intensity, Lyrale and Shethys were preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice. They would pour all of their accumulated power into the transmission array, not to call more Krethmori to Earth, but to send a message across the galaxy that would awaken every sleeping guardian and rally every surviving resistance movement to a final stand. But the message would require a focus, a single point of will strong enough to direct the energy across the vast distances between star systems. It needed someone who had lost everything but retained the ability to hope, someone who understood both the value of life and the necessity of death. It needed someone human. Marcus placed his hands on the control panel and felt the alien technology respond to his touch. But now, it wasn't responding to his understanding of Krethmori command codes. It was responding to something much deeper, the same force that had driven him to fight alone against impossible odds for month after month. The tower's systems were recognizing him not as an enemy or a prisoner, but as something the aliens had never encountered before. The Krethmori commander shouted orders to the battle cruisers overhead, his voice carrying a note of panic that Marcus found deeply satisfying. The alien had finally realized that their carefully laid trap had become something else entirely. The tower was no longer under their control, and the energy it was generating was building towards something that their scientific instruments couldn't measure or predict. Plasma cannons opened fire from the lead battle cruiser, their beams striking the tower's surface with enough force to melt steel. But the crystalline structure absorbed the energy and fed it into the core, making it burn even brighter. The more the aliens attacked their own installation, the more powerful it became. Shethys spread her wings and launched herself into the air, her silver scales now blazing with starlight. She moved toward the nearest battle cruiser with such speed that she seemed to teleport across the distance, her claws extending into energy projections that could tear through the ship's armor like it was made of paper. The cruiser's defensive systems opened fire, filling the air with deadly energy beams, but she moved between them like she could see the future. Lyrale remained on the ground beside Marcus, her hands moving in complex patterns as she wove power into the tower's transmission array. Her voice rose in a song that seemed to contain the harmony of 1,000 worlds, each note precisely calibrated to resonate with the cosmic forces that connected every star system in the galaxy. Through their mental link, Marcus could feel the song spreading outward at faster-than-light speed, carrying their message to civilizations he had never imagined. The message was simple but devastating in its implications. The Krethmori were not the unstoppable force they claimed to be. They could be defeated, and their defeat had already begun on a small blue world in an insignificant solar system at the galaxy's edge. The humans, a species so young that most civilizations had never heard of them, had produced a warrior capable of turning the invaders' own weapons against them. But the transmission was not just a call to arms. It was also a beacon of hope, proof that the forces of creation and protection could triumph over those of destruction and exploitation. Every species that received the message would understand that the time for hiding and running was over. The final battle for the galaxy's freedom was beginning, and Earth would be ground zero. The lead battle cruiser was listing badly now, its engines sputtering as HFY's tore through its internal systems with surgical precision. But the other two ships were moving to bracket the tower, their main cannons charging for a bombardment that would reduce the entire mountain to radioactive ash. The Krethmori had decided that if they couldn't control the tower, they would destroy it and everyone near it. Marcus felt Lyralay's song reach its crescendo, the final notes carrying such beauty and power that tears ran down his face despite the desperate situation. The transmission array activated with a sound like reality tearing, and suddenly the night sky was filled with streaks of light as the message raced toward every corner of the galaxy. But the effort had cost Lyralay everything. Her scales were losing their luster, and her golden eyes were dimming as her life force flowed into the tower's core. She was dying, sacrificing herself to ensure that their message reached its intended targets. Through their fading mental link, Marcus felt her gratitude for his willingness to stand with them, and her sorrow that they would not live to see the galaxy they were trying to save. The remaining Krethmori battle cruisers opened fire simultaneously, their combined bombardment creating a pillar of destructive energy that should have vaporized everything within a mile radius. But the tower's crystal core had absorbed so much power that it had transcended its original design parameters. Instead of being destroyed, it became a lens that focused and redirected the incoming energy. The redirected bombardment struck the lead battle cruiser just as HFY's emerged from its hull, her mission of sabotage complete. The ship exploded in a fireball that lit up the entire valley, its wreckage raining down on the mountain slopes like burning meteors. But the explosion also created a feedback pulse that traveled through the tower's systems, overloading circuits and causing critical failures throughout the installation. Marcus realized that the tower was about to explode, and the detonation would be powerful enough to crack the planet's crust. Worse, the energy release would disrupt the transmission array before their message could reach all of its intended targets. All of their sacrifice would be meaningless if the beacon failed before the galaxy's guardians could respond. There was only one way to prevent the catastrophic failure. Someone had to manually regulate the power flow through the tower's core, balancing the input and output until the transmission was complete. It was a task that required precise timing and an intimate understanding of both human determination and Dragonmaiden wisdom. It was also certain suicide. Lyralay tried to move toward the core, but she could barely stand. HFY's was falling from the sky, her own power exhausted by her battle with the battle cruiser. The task fell to Marcus, the human warrior who had learned to hope without illusion and fight without hatred. As he approached the tower's core, Marcus thought about his wife and daughter, waiting for him somewhere beyond the veil of death. He thought about all the worlds that the Krethmori had destroyed, and all the worlds they would destroy if this plan failed. He thought about the two magnificent creatures who had trusted him enough to share their power and their hope. Most of all, he thought about the choice that had brought him to this moment. The choice to care about something beyond his own survival, to stand and fight when running would have been easier, to believe in tomorrow even when today seemed hopeless. Marcus placed his hands on the crystal core and felt the full power of a dying star flow through his body. The energy should have killed him instantly, but somehow he remained conscious, his human will serving as a bridge between the destructive and creative forces that the tower was channeling. He became part of the transmission itself, his determination and hope spreading across the galaxy alongside Lyralay's song. Through the cosmic link, he felt the message being received on 1,000 worlds. He sensed ancient guardians awakening from long slumber, resistance movements rallying their forces, and refugee fleets changing course toward Earth. The galaxy was answering their call, but it would take time for help to arrive. The remaining battle cruisers were withdrawing now, their commanders recognizing that the situation had moved beyond their ability to control. But they were not retreating. They were regrouping, calling for reinforcements that would arrive long before the galaxy's defenders could reach Earth. The final phase of the battle was approaching, and Marcus knew that he would not survive to see its conclusion. But as his consciousness began to fade, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had found his purpose in the darkness, and he had given everything in service of something greater than himself. The tower's core pulsed one final time, and Marcus Thorne, the last warrior of Earth, became a beacon of hope that would shine across the galaxy for generations to come. Marcus awoke to the sound of singing, but it was different from the Dragonmaidens' voices. This melody was deeper, more complex, carrying harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space itself. As consciousness returned to him, he realized he was no longer standing in the tower's core. Instead, he lay on something soft and warm that pulsed with a gentle, living rhythm. Opening his eyes, Marcus found himself staring up at a sky filled with stars that moved in slow, deliberate patterns across the heavens. But these weren't the stars he remembered from Earth's night sky. These celestial bodies were alive, their light carrying messages and emotions that his enhanced senses could now interpret. He was no longer on his home planet. The surface beneath him shifted, and Marcus sat up to discover that he was resting on the back of a creature so vast that its edges disappeared beyond the horizon. The being's hide was covered in scales that ranged from deep emerald to brilliant gold, each one the size of a house, and inscribed with symbols that seemed to write themselves as he watched. Lyrelay materialized beside him, but she was transformed. Her scales now held the light of newborn stars, and her wings had grown to encompass dimensions that mortal eyes couldn't fully process. When she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of eons and the warmth of a mother's lullaby simultaneously. She explained that Marcus had not died in the tower's core. Instead, the energy he had channeled had transformed him, elevating his consciousness to a level where he could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. He was still human in essence, but he had become something more, a bridge between the material and spiritual realms that few beings could ever achieve. The creature they rode was Vorthak the Ancient, the first of the Dragon Guardians, and the being responsible for maintaining the cosmic balance that kept the galaxy from descending into chaos. Vorthak had been sleeping in the space between dimensions for millions of years, but the beacon Marcus and the Dragonmaidens had created had awakened him to the threat posed by the Crethmori. Sheath-Eyes appeared on Marcus's other side, her own transformation even more dramatic than Lyrelay's. Her silver scales had become translucent windows into the quantum realm, showing glimpses of infinite possible futures branching out from every moment. She had become an oracle of sorts, capable of seeing the potential outcomes of their actions and guiding them toward the path that led to victory. Through their enhanced mental connection, the three companions shared their experiences during the time Marcus had been unconscious. The message they had sent across the galaxy had been received by hundreds of guardian species, each responding according to their own capabilities and the threats they faced in their local regions. But the response had not been what anyone expected. Rather than sending fleets to Earth's defense, the Galactic Guardians had chosen a different strategy. They had begun to awaken sleeping powers throughout the universe, ancient defenses that had been dormant since the last great war between order and chaos. The Crethmori were not just facing a military response. They were triggering a fundamental shift in the cosmic balance that would reshape reality itself. But this transformation came with risks that were almost as dangerous as the original threat. The forces being unleashed were older than most star systems and far more powerful than anything the current galaxy had ever contained. If they could not be properly controlled and directed, they would consume everything in their path, destroying the very civilizations they were meant to protect. That was why Marcus had been preserved and transformed. His human nature gave him the unique ability to serve as a stabilizing influence on powers that were beyond the comprehension of most species. He could channel cosmic forces without being overwhelmed by them, and his connection to the Dragonmaidens provided the wisdom needed to use those forces constructively rather than destructively. Vorthak's voice rumbled through the dimensional space around them, each word carrying the weight of geological ages. The Ancient explained that the war with the Crethmori was entering its final phase, but it would not be fought with conventional weapons on familiar battlefields. Instead, it would be a conflict between fundamental concepts: order versus chaos, creation versus consumption, hope versus despair. The enemy had already begun to respond to the changing cosmic conditions. Crethmori fleets throughout the galaxy were converging on specific points in space where the fabric of reality was thinnest, attempting to tear holes between dimensions that would allow them to escape the consequences of their actions. If they succeeded, they would simply move to another reality and begin their harvesting operations again, leaving behind a universe drained of all life and meaning. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Once again, he was being asked to stand against impossible odds in defense of something greater than himself. But this time, he was not alone. The Dragonmaidens were with him, their power amplifying his own, and behind them stood the accumulated wisdom and strength of 1,000 guardian species. The plan they revealed to him was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. They would use the same dimensional manipulation techniques that the Crethmori were attempting, but instead of trying to escape to another reality, they would create a cascade effect that would seal all the dimensional barriers in this region of the universe. The invaders would be trapped in a reality where the natural laws had been rewritten to prevent their existence. But the technique required a sacrifice that made Marcus's heart ache with familiar grief. Someone would have to remain behind to maintain the seal, spending eternity as a guardian of the dimensional barriers. They would exist in a state between life and death, conscious but cut off from all contact with the living universe. It was a fate worse than any death Marcus could imagine, an endless solitude that would stretch across billions of years. Vorthak began to descend toward a point in space where reality grew thin, and the stars seemed to flicker like candle flames in a strong wind. As they approached, Marcus could see the Crethmori fleet massed around a massive tier in the fabric of the universe. The aliens had already begun their escape, with hundreds of ships disappearing into the dimensional rift every few seconds. The sight of his enemies fleeing from the consequences of their actions filled Marcus with a rage that burned brighter than the core of a star. These creatures had destroyed his world, murdered his family, and harvested the life force of countless civilizations. Now they thought they could simply run away and start over somewhere else, leaving behind nothing but dead worlds and broken dreams. But Lyralei's voice in his mind counseled patience and wisdom. Anger was a tool that could be used to fuel their efforts, but it could not be allowed to control their actions. The dimensional seal they were about to create would prevent the Crethmori from ever threatening another universe, but it would also trap any remaining survivors in a reality that had been fundamentally altered to prevent their species from existing. The moral implications of what they were planning troubled Marcus deeply. By sealing the dimensional barriers, they would be committing genocide on a scale that dwarfed anything the Crethmori themselves had accomplished. They would be erasing an entire species from existence, eliminating any possibility of redemption or change. Sheatheyes shared her visions of possible futures, showing Marcus the outcomes of various choices they could make. If they allowed the Crethmori to escape, the aliens would eventually return with forces powerful enough to crack reality itself, reducing the entire universe to raw material for their consumption. If they used conventional military force to stop the evacuation, the battle would destroy so many star systems that the galaxy would never recover. Only the dimensional seal offered a path to victory that preserved the possibility of life continuing to flourish throughout the universe. It was a terrible choice, but it was the only choice that honored the sacrifice of all those who had died fighting against the invaders. As Vorthak settled into position at the dimensional rift's edge, Marcus felt the cosmic forces beginning to gather around them. Reality itself was preparing to be rewritten, and he could sense the fundamental laws of physics beginning to shift in response to their intentions. The power they were about to unleash made the tower's energy output look like a flickering candle in comparison. The Crethmori had detected their presence now, and the alien fleet was turning to face them with weapons that could tear holes in space-time itself. But the invaders' conventional technology was useless against opponents who existed partially outside of normal dimensional space. Their energy beams passed harmlessly through Vorthak's massive form, and their missiles exploded against barriers that existed in dimensions the aliens couldn't perceive. Marcus stood at the focal point of the gathering energy, with Lyralei and Sheatheyes flanking him like living pillars of cosmic power. Together, they began the ritual that would reshape reality itself, their combined will serving as the catalyst for forces that predated the birth of stars. The dimensional rift began to collapse as the fundamental constants that governed its existence were systematically altered. Space and time twisted around the focal point, creating impossible geometries that made Marcus's enhanced mind reel with vertigo. The Crethmori ships caught in the collapsing portal were crushed out of existence, their screaming crews reduced to quantum probability rather than living matter. But the effort was taking its toll on all three of them. Marcus could feel his consciousness stretching across multiple dimensions simultaneously, his sense of individual identity beginning to fragment under the cosmic forces flowing through him. This was the price of wielding power that was meant to be shared among thousands of guardian spirits, and he knew that surviving the experience would require him to sacrifice everything that made him recognizably human. As the dimensional seal neared completion, Marcus made his final choice. Instead of trying to preserve his individual consciousness, he would allow it to merge with the cosmic forces they were channeling, becoming part of the eternal guardian system that would protect reality from future threats. But Lyrelei and Shethys had other plans. In a coordinated effort that spoke of perfect trust and understanding, they poured their own life force into the dimensional seal, taking upon themselves the burden that Marcus had been prepared to bear. Their sacrifice completed the ritual with such power that the dimensional barriers didn't just seal. They crystallized into a permanent structure that would prevent any similar attempts to breach reality's foundations. The Crethmori were trapped forever in a universe that no longer allowed their existence, while the forces of creation and protection were free to restore what had been damaged and build something better in its place. Marcus found himself alone on Vorthak's back as the Ancient began the long journey toward Earth. The Dragonmaidens were gone, their consciousness now spread across the dimensional barriers they had helped to create. But their voices still echoed in his mind, promising that their sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the galaxy they had died to protect would flourish in ways that none of them had ever imagined. 10 years had passed since the dimensional seal was completed, and Earth had become something that Marcus barely recognized. Vorthak the Ancient had carried him back to his home world, but what he found there defied everything he thought he understood about life, death, and the nature of existence itself. The planet's surface was covered with crystalline structures that pulsed with the same energy he had seen in the Crethmori Tower, but these formations radiated warmth and life instead of cold harvesting power. Where cities had once stood, vast gardens now stretched across the landscape, tended by beings that seemed to be part human and part something far more magnificent. The survivors of humanity had been transformed by the cosmic forces unleashed during the final battle. They retained their essential human nature, but they had also gained abilities that allowed them to communicate with the planet itself, to heal wounds with a touch, and to see across dimensions with perfect clarity. They were still human, but they had become the best possible version of what humanity could be. Marcus walked through the transformed landscape with a sense of wonder that he hadn't felt since childhood. The air itself sang with harmonies that reminded him of Lyrelei and Shethys, and he realized that the Dragonmaidens' sacrifice had done more than just seal the dimensional barriers. Their life force had merged with Earth's biosphere, transforming the planet into a living memorial to their courage and compassion. Children played in the gardens, their laughter carrying undertones of music that seemed to make the flowers bloom brighter and the trees grow taller. These were the offspring of the survivors, beings born after the transformation who possessed abilities that surpassed even those of their enhanced parents. They could shape matter with their thoughts, travel between dimensions at will, and communicate with species across the galaxy through bonds of pure empathy. But it was not a perfect paradise. Marcus could see the weight of memory in the eyes of the adult survivors, the knowledge of everything that had been lost in the war against the Crethmori. They had gained incredible power, but they had paid for it with the deaths of billions of their fellow humans and the sacrifice of two noble beings who had given everything to save a species they had barely known. In the heart of the largest garden, Marcus found a monument unlike anything he had ever seen. It was not built from stone or metal, but from crystallized light itself, taking the form of two dragon maidens with their wings spread in protective embrace around a smaller figure that he recognized as himself. The monument sang with voices that he knew belonged to Lyrelei and Shethys, their melodies now part of Earth's eternal song. Standing before the monument was a woman whose face was familiar despite the changes that the transformation had brought. She had been one of the survivors from the underground camps, a scientist who had helped develop the weapons Marcus had used against the aliens. But now, she radiated a peace and wisdom that spoke of direct communion with the cosmic forces that governed reality. Dr. Elena Vasquez turned as Marcus approached, her enhanced senses having detected his presence long before his physical form became visible. When their eyes met, he saw recognition dawn in her transformed features, followed by an emotion so profound that it brought tears to both their faces. She explained that the survivors had been waiting for his return. guided by visions that the Dragonmaidens had shared through their connection to Earth's transformed biosphere. They knew that he had been changed by his experiences beyond the dimensional barriers, that he had become something more than human while retaining the essential qualities that made him a guardian and protector. The human survivors had not been idle during his absence. They had used their new abilities to reach out across the galaxy, making contact with the species that the Crethmori had threatened or enslaved. They had become healers and teachers, sharing the wisdom they had gained through suffering and the power they had inherited through sacrifice. But they had also discovered something troubling in their explorations of the cosmic network that connected all living worlds. The dimensional seal that had trapped the Crethmori was not as permanent as they had believed. The alien species possessed knowledge and technology that predated most of the current galactic civilizations, and some of their imprisoned remnants were already working to find ways around the barriers that confined them. Elena led Marcus deeper into the garden, where other survivors had gathered around a pool of water that reflected not the sky above, but visions of distant worlds and possible futures. Through the enhanced perception that came with his transformation, Marcus could see the images that danced across the water's surface. On some worlds, Crethmori survivors had found ways to project their consciousness across dimensional boundaries, influencing the development of local species and turning them into unwitting servants. On others, the aliens had discovered artifacts left behind by even older civilizations, technologies that could potentially crack the barriers that held them prisoner. The most disturbing visions showed possible futures where the dimensional seal was broken, and the Crethmori returned to normal space with power and knowledge that far exceeded what they had possessed during their original invasion. These were not the desperate harvesting fleets that had attacked Earth. They were transformed into beings of pure malevolent energy, capable of consuming entire solar systems with a thought. But the visions also showed paths to victory, scenarios where the scattered guardians of the galaxy united under Earth's leadership to create defenses that would hold against any possible threat. These futures required sacrifice and courage that would test every species to their absolute limits, but they offered hope that the universe could be made safe for all time. Marcus studied the visions for hours, his enhanced mind processing possibilities and probabilities with speed and accuracy that would have been impossible during his purely human existence. Gradually, a plan began to form, one that would require everything he had learned during his journey through the dimensional barriers and his time with the Dragon Guardians. The key lay in understanding what the Crethmori truly were beneath their predatory behavior and harvesting technology. They had not always been the monsters that had invaded Earth. Long ago, they had been a species much like humanity, capable of both great creativity and terrible destruction. But they had made choices that had led them down a path of consumption and exploitation, gradually losing their ability to create or nurture until only their hunger remained. The dimensional seal had not just trapped them, it had also preserved them in their current state, preventing them from either redemption or final dissolution. They existed in a kind of cosmic purgatory, their consciousness slowly fragmenting under the weight of their own accumulated malevolence. Marcus realized that there might be a way to break this cycle, to offer a choice between destruction and transformation. It would require him to enter the sealed dimensions where they were imprisoned, to face them not as an enemy but as a teacher and guide. The risk was enormous. If he failed, he would be trapped with them forever, gradually consumed by the same forces that had corrupted them. But the alternative was to wait for the barriers to eventually weaken and fail, allowing the Crethmori to return to normal space as beings of pure destructive energy. That path led only to the eventual death of everything in the universe, a future so bleak that even the possibility of failure seemed preferable. Elena and the other survivors listened as Marcus explained his plan, their enhanced perception allowing them to see the potential consequences of every decision they might make. They understood the risks he was proposing to take, and they knew that if he failed, Earth and all its transformed inhabitants would become the primary targets when the aliens eventually escaped their prison. But they also understood that this might be their only chance to end the threat permanently, to transform their enemies into allies and heal wounds that stretched across the galaxy. The choice was unanimous. Marcus would have their support and their power to draw upon when he entered the sealed dimensions. The preparation took months as the survivors worked together to create a new type of dimensional portal, one that could carry Marcus into the aliens' prison without breaking the barriers that held them confined. They poured their combined wisdom and energy into the project, creating something that was part technology and part pure will made manifest. On the day of departure, Marcus stood before the memorial to the Dragonmaidens one final time. He could feel their presence in the crystallized light, their voices joining the eternal song that had become Earth's heartbeat. Through the cosmic connection they shared, he felt their blessing and their confidence that he would succeed in his impossible mission. As he stepped through the dimensional portal, Marcus carried with him not just his own determination and courage, but the hopes and dreams of every living being in the galaxy. He was no longer just a human warrior fighting against impossible odds. He had become something greater, a bridge between what was and what could be, a guardian whose purpose was not just to destroy evil, but to transform it into something worthy of redemption. Behind him, Earth continued its song of renewal and hope, while ahead lay a confrontation that would determine the ultimate fate of the universe itself. Marcus Thorne, the man who had learned to choose hope over despair and love over hatred, stepped into the darkness to light the way toward a future that none of them could yet imagine. The final battle was not ending. It was beginning anew, and this time the victory would belong not to the strongest or the most ruthless, but to those who understood that true power came from the willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than themselves. The universe itself held its breath as one man prepared to face the accumulated malevolence of an entire species and offer them the one thing they had never expected to receive. A chance at redemption,